Another week, another Ramble, and this week we're actually not going to be touching on anything related to the game necessarily, or to the games, primarily because in old school you just had the little bug fixes and stuff like that for the Royal Titans. You had a couple of other things, but mostly minor things, which yeah, I didn't end up touching on Royal Titans because it was just like, yeah, it's mid-game content, there's not much to talk about it, and I mean, outside of it's good to have mid-game content. And in RuneScape 3, they're pretty much getting prepared for the combat achievements release, and I will probably end up talking about that next week, although I don't think I'm gonna be like a huge person to talk about those, because I'm not gonna do that many to begin with. I haven't done that many in old school either, or most of the ones I've done kind of accidentally, because I've just done the bosses and they just completed by themselves, so I never actually entered combat achievements, but still I have thoughts on the macro, especially the game, what's the name, like influence that they have, not influence, but you know, impact, there you go, the game impact that they have. So overall, I think I'm gonna leave that topic for next week. This week, however, I want to touch on something that I've kind of seen throughout the last couple of years, and I mean, it's kind of something that I've always seen pretty much ever since I started the channel, even when I only made old school content, which is RuneScape 3 content kinda sucks. And the thing is, this is a statement that is still used today. And it's a statement that I kinda disagree with. Maybe like 5, 6, 7 years ago, I would have agreed. You know, by then you really did not have that many RuneScape 3 content creators, and most of them were just doing either guide content, or they were making, you know, game updates type content, or just progress videos generally speaking, without any spice or anything like that. The thing is, nowadays though, I still see this argument and I just cannot agree with it, primarily because there are a lot of people in RuneScape 3 that are actually doing very cool shit. It just happens that most of them tend to be pretty small creators, primarily because while the RuneScape 3 community loves complaining about the lack of good content creators, they also don't generally tend to support content creators much, especially the ones that are more upcoming and the ones that don't have the level of polish that the bigger content creators have and can afford to have. So as a result, I don't know, I don't like that argument too much, you know, especially when most of the content that tends to get boosted is still the same game updates content or basically guides and stuff like that, and you know, like, I get it, you know, they're useful and everything, and ultimately I understand why they're popular, and I understand why people make them. I mean, some people don't make them because of views, some people just make them because they want to, and the views are just an extra that comes, I guess, because they like to talk about the game, and especially if you've already done everything that the game has to offer, it's kinda hard for you to make content that doesn't touch on the new content that comes into the game and the new updates that come into the game. Personally, you know, I like to search for weird things in the game and whatnot to try and make content more unique, but, you know, some people just don't enjoy doing that, and that's completely fine. So I'm not saying that it's bad that these people get support or whatever, it's just, you know, they get the views, and that's the reality of the situation. Now, the thing is, most of the people that tend to use this argument are also the people that are mostly in-game. They're the people that are already very invested into the game. And this is where I need to kind of admit a fault, which is, in the past, I've had the take that you probably shouldn't be making guides if you don't have the experience to support the guide you're making. A guide is supposed to be, well, a guide. It's supposed to guide you through content that people haven't done. So usually it should come from people that have done said piece of content, because they're the ones that have the experience and knowledge to guide you through that piece of content. The reality is, however, that it doesn't happen that often, primarily because a lot of specially basic guides tend to be made by people that don't really have the experience, and in the past I have criticized certain people because of that specific thing, making guides, specially skilling guides, without even having level 80, not even 70, to actually make those guides. And usually the argument boils down to the information is out there, right, which is it's something that I don't really enjoy too much, because, you know, it's different from having the information, and it's different from actually being an expert and having experience doing something. Just because I watch a guide on a boss doesn't mean I know how to do it. You know, yeah, theoretically I do, but practically there might be a couple of details specially that allow you to kill the boss that, you know, if you never touched the boss, if you never did the boss, you might have never realized. Perfect example for this was the guide that I made on Zulrah. I made the Zulrah guide like a year and a half ago, specifically because when I was learning Zulrah, every guide was the same. Oh yeah, just, you know, fucking remember 4 different rotations with different phases that attack you with different attack styles where you need to stand on different spots. For a person like Zulrah is like the noob gate of PvM in old school. If you can do Zulrah, you can do most in-game PvM. If you can't do Zulrah, you still need to practice a little bit and learn a little bit. Basically, Zulrah is like that, you know, shooting and moving type gameplay, PvM gameplay that, you know, old school is known when it comes to the end-game stuff. That, you know, some of the bosses don't really have more towards the early game. And as a result, a lot of guys were just, oh yeah, look, I know that you're a new player, and I know that you probably don't really know how to do this boss, and you're gonna feel completely fucking overwhelmed, but I'm gonna overwhelm you even further with the guide, because just memorize all of this, bro, you know. And it's like, I didn't find that to be very good when teaching people on how to actually do the boss, especially because as someone with experience at the time of making that guide where I have like 6,000 kills or something, I noticed a lot of patterns that essentially were, you know, true like 90% of the times, which were much easier to actually figure out. For example, usually people getting into PvM have a huge trouble learning how to move, right? It's easy to click on a boss and attack, but moving and then having to heal and then click on the boss again and switching gears while you're doing so is kind of overwhelming. So usually when someone is doing Zulrah, they're either not attacking because they're moving, or they're not moving and they're attacking. So as a result, what I did was basically notice that, hey, actually when the poison clouds disappear, Zulrah is gonna spawn more of them, but Zulrah never spawns poison clouds in the side of the arena that Zulrah is on. It's always on the opposite side of the arena. So usually if you see poison clouds disappearing, or venom clouds, because it's, I guess venom and poison are different mechanics, you run to the other side of the arena, and then you see them disappear again, you run to the other side. Or essentially every 2 phases you run, because that's usually when Zulrah tends to, or when the mechanic tends to dissipate and Zulrah tends to refresh that mechanic. These were the things I noticed. Now, what do you think is easier to teach people? Do you think it's easier to teach them, yeah, by the way, just move when you see the clouds disappearing, or oh yeah, just memorize 4 different rotations with up to 7, between 7 and 12 phases each? Like, the second option is just way more overwhelming, but it's the option that every single guide did. And I think that a lot of guides did that because a lot of people just don't have that experience of teaching people how to do things, especially from a basic perspective. Look, most people that are looking at Zulrah guides, they're not looking at Zulrah guides because they already know how to do the boss and want to improve in it. They're looking at Zulrah guides because they don't know how to do the boss and are expecting you to teach the boss in a certain way and teach the mechanics in a certain way that doesn't overwhelm them, that can actually just teach them how to do the boss, that prepares them when going into the boss. Obviously nothing substitutes experience, but at least, you know, if people know that, okay, I just need to keep this one thing in mind when doing this boss, they can somewhat figure out the rest because they already feel confident enough. Most guides just didn't have that into consideration, and I'm not saying that most guides didn't kill the boss or whatever, most did, but still, I think that it's important to teach things, especially from a basic perspective, to people. And that's something that I noticed, and that's something that I came to the realization, is that as much as I don't think you should be making an in-depth guide on a boss you don't have a lot of experience on, or a skill you don't have a lot of experience on, at the same time, it's much different making an in-depth boss guide, or making an in-depth money maker, or an in-depth skilling guide, or whatever, and making a basic one. Those are 2 different things. And the reality is, basic guides tend to actually call a lot of people to them. Basic guides, regardless of how saturated they are. When I released my guide, my Zulrah guide, Zulrah has been in the game since 2015, I think, so like 8 years. And it still did fairly well for a channel that at the time had like 100 subs, I think. That's how many subs I had at the time. So clearly, despite of how saturated the market of guides and everything is, there's still demand for them, because there's always new people, new casual people getting into the game. And that's where I want to get with all of this. As much as I think there needs to be a separation between people that are really good at, a specific thing in the game, and they should 100% be the ones that are indicated to make in-game or, in-depth guides or super experienced guides or whatever, there's also a lack of basic guides in RuneScape 3. Like, RuneScape 3 just does not have basic guides for most casual players to interact with. Most guides in RuneScape 3 are either super in-depth, or they just lack the appeal that casual players usually look in a guide, which is explaining things in a way where it makes players feel confident about their own skills and knowledge about the game. Explain things in a way that is very boiled down and easy to understand. Because, look, as someone who's made a lot of videos on game design, let me just tell you, people understanding content, how do I put this, not fucking easy. It's not easy to make people understand content. Like, I make a lot of effort into, even during those videos, to try and or explain things in a way that makes sense, and a lot of people still don't get it, right? So with guides, which is supposed to, actually teach them, because with my videos, they're kind of trivia in a way, right? Regardless if people learn or don't learn or understand or don't understand, the game is not gonna suffer for it. The player is not gonna suffer for it. But with guides, if you watch a guide and you put time and commitment into watching a guide that doesn't really either teach you all that well or leaves you more confused than what you started with, then you're gonna run into the problem of frustrating the player, right? The player is gonna feel frustrated with the game and is gonna feel frustrated with the community. Now, this is all very important because appealing guides for basic casual players is an important aspect of bringing players into the community to watch more RuneScape content. Oftentimes in the game, we tend to look at the devs and say, okay, you need to make the early game better and the mid game better, so when players get into the game, they actually stick around because they see that the game is good. But we really don't have that thought when it comes to RuneScape content, especially on YouTube, especially when it comes to RuneScape 3. There's a bridge that needs to be gapped between, or crossed rather, between casual players that just sort of got into the game and being committed or being incentivized to keep interacting with the game or keep interacting with the content in the game. Because what happens in old school is that a lot of casual players rarely play the game, or oftentimes some of them have, played the game in ages, right? But they still watch the content that players put out. They still watch the content that a lot of content creators put out. And I think the reason as to why they even came across that content to begin with was because they had sort of a gateway drug type content, which is usually guides. As much as I like RuneScape and everything, the first type of content I watched on YouTube relating to RuneScape years and years and years ago was guide content. I wanted to learn how to make some GP in the game for a bond, so I watched some videos on how to make some GP for a bond, right? Even with the wiki and everything, there's a lot of casual players prefer watching the game, because watching the game and watching people interact with the game is always going to teach you more than the wiki. I think that the wiki is more for the people that are already experienced and don't want to waste their time watching a video. And I think that in RuneScape 3 you have a lack of basic guides for people that are consistently there, because I think one of the biggest issues in RuneScape 3 is you don't have anyone that is committed to actually release, 2-3 days in terms of releasing guides, which is something that a lot of old school people do. A lot of old school content creators actually do when it comes to making guide content. Granted, again, that is not going to leave you space for you to do in-depth guides or to have detailed breakdowns of bosses and stuff like that. But what they do very well is that because of the quantity of them, so many casual players come across them, and when players come across a casual guide and then they, essentially perceive that, hey, the community is actually really helpful, because look at all of these cool videos that are easy to understand, they're well edited, right, they're very appealing, and they provide very useful information. Essentially you start sticking around, and the more you stick around in the game, the more you get interested for the other types of content that appear in the game. If a player spends 200 hours in the game versus one that spends 50, the player that spent 200 hours in the game is always going to have more opportunities to hear about other content creators that don't make guide content. But for the player to do that, you also need a community that kind of can push the player and incentivize the player to keep playing the game and keep staying within the game and the community. And I think RuneScape 3 kinda lacks that high quality, you know, very reliable, consistent person that continuously makes basic guides. Because as much as I think that, you know, especially in-game players are a bit of noobs when it comes to watching RuneScape content, because a lot of them just outright dismiss people that, you know, don't really play the game the way they want or whatever. Even the people that don't do, like, it's very clear to see the type of people that watch YouTube in RuneScape 3. It's very common for you to go to any progress series in RuneScape 3, scroll through the comments and have people pretty much just backseat gaming, telling you should do XYZ because it's better for your account. These people aren't doing it because, you know, like, I want to backseat and I want to teach this person how to play the game or whatever, right? They're doing it because they want to be genuinely helpful to players. But that's the thing. You see a lot of comments like that. In old school, you don't. In old school, most of the comments you see are from casual players that, again, oftentimes haven't even played the game in months, but they still watch the content because the content is super appealing, and they started watching the content when they played the game and watched other RuneScape content, right? So I think that RuneScape 3, in order to call, especially, we need a bigger casual audience for RuneScape 3 content. And I think that passes through having sort of an open door, right? A sort of entry point for this. And I think that entry point, one of the good entry points, can be exactly guide content. Guide content gets a lot of views, especially from a casual audience, and I think that if that guide content is really good, especially when it comes to things that everyone searches all the time, like money makers, I think that can really lead people to stay more interested in the game for longer and stay more interested in the RuneScape content that is being done. Because if I'm watching, you know, guide content all the time, and this person is actually high quality and they put nice videos, you know, they're well edited, they're informative and everything, and then I see, you know, something on the side that kind of catches my eye, even if it's not a guide content, that content is being recommended because you're already watching RuneScape content. So, you know, YouTube is more likely to recommend you RuneScape content. But again, YouTube can only do that if you already show interest in RuneScape content. And I think guides are a very good entry point of doing that, especially money makers. I've noticed that there's a huge lack of good money making methods on YouTube in RuneScape 3 when it comes to them being high quality, right? Like, there's a lot of them, sure, but they're either super exaggerated in the amount of GP you can actually make per hour, or when you watch them, they don't really have any editing whatsoever, when usually these are things that people want to watch, not things that people want to hear, right? So it's a bit like, we need basically someone, like, people that will do that work, and I just think that right now, you really don't have anyone like that. You know, honestly, I thought about doing it, I'm gonna be honest, I thought about doing it, because, you know, I'm always looking for ways of making GP in RuneScape 3 that don't involve PVM, because usually it's the old song and dance, I need to make GP, and people just go, oh, just do PVM, bro, just do PVM, you know, PVM solves your issues, and I'm like, okay, but I don't want to do PVM, you know, what the fuck do I do then? You know, I think there's a huge lack of, like, people that offer alternative money makers, so I thought about it already. The reality is, I'm kind of like busy with other projects, but quite frankly, if I ever end up, which I mean obviously I will, but I don't know when I will do that, but when I end up finishing the engineering video, which should be coming this month, and the music reviews, which is a bit big, and I only have no bank, I might end up doing like kind of what Soup does, where Soup does Gillenor games, and then when he's not doing Gillenor games, he has videos ready to show money makers to supply his essentially Gillenor games videos, right? So instead of just having Gillenor games, he has other videos when he doesn't have Gillenor games to supply the channel with videos, right? And they're super interesting, you know, they don't, like, they're not exactly the most super high quality Hollywood type shit, but they don't need to be. They're just videos that show you interesting money makers and if they're viable, and, you know, oftentimes you just watch not because you want to learn how to do a money maker, but just because, hey, that's really interesting content actually, you know, like, I didn't even know you could actually make money with that, or I didn't even know that you could actually get that item or whatever, right? It's just genuinely interesting, you know, and I thought about doing it, and honestly in the future I might do it. But it's definitely the type of thing that I think RuneScape 3 really needs. That casual, super easy to find content that hooks casual players in to stay and watch content, even if, they then quit the game. You just need to get them to the stage where, oh shit, RuneScape content is actually super interesting, so even if I don't play the game, I still want to keep watching it. Because that's what happens with people like Settled, for example. A lot of people that watch the guy don't actually play the game. But again, you don't need to, right? Sometimes players are good enough and content creators are good enough to carry out interesting things and engaging videos, engaging concepts, without you even needing to play the game to get into them, right? We just need to get people on the door to explore and actually, propel those content creators that are more unique, that are doing interesting things, that need an audience desperately, and that, look, ultimately, if the end-game players, the people that say that RuneScape 3 content sucks and all of that, if those don't want to support the smaller content creators, then we need casual viewers to support that content creators. And before that, we need to get them through the door, which right now, it's a bit hard to do in RuneScape 3. But yeah, that's obviously, there's a lot of other things you could do to bring more casual viewers to the RuneScape 3 scene and everything. One is, for example, making the game better for casual players, rather than, continuously make treasure hunter promotions and leave the early game so unattended that it has been years since the last time it was fixed, and a lot of content in early game is just janky as fuck, right? Yeah, sure, there's a lot of things that you could do, but I think that when it comes to specifically content on YouTube, I think RuneScape 3 is really just lacking that entry point. And I wish that, someday someone is gonna feel it, even if someday that someone is me.